Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Berner, and I serve as Associate Professor and Director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. It is an honor and a joy to welcome you all today to the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center in Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is hosted by Dr. Christopher Morphew, Professor and Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Education, and Dr. Chiedo Nwankwor, the Vice Dean for Education and Academic Affairs and Senior Lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Our guest today is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to education. But what does this role entail? The United Nations international covenants all reinforce in different ways the evolving right to education. For example, the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights all affirm in different ways that education shall be free and compulsory in the elementary age, that the states that are signatories to these conventions undertake to respect parents and to ensure that their children are educated in the religious and ethical views that conform to their own. And also that all schools conform to minimal educational standards that are set by the state. So we have here the right to education, the liberty of parents, adherence to educational standards. These are powerful words, but they're very difficult to ensure. They're difficult to ensure in all times, in all places. But what about ensuring these rights in under-resourced regions and countries with inadequate infrastructure, roads, inadequate water, internet connectivity, or in places with historic tensions between minority and majority cultures, or with traditional exclusionary practices, not to mention the realities of civil war, pandemic, and international conflict. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to education has to sit astride all of these factions and factors and minister to all of them. The Special Rapporteur for the right to education must keep in view without prejudice both the universal and the local. The Special Rapporteur, in other words, belongs to the world. And we are honored to have with us today the current occupant of this global chair, Madam Farida Shaheed, at the conclusion of her 10-day visit to the United States. Ms. Shaheed is a renowned sociologist. She's the executive director of Pakistan's preeminent gender rights organization, the Women's Resource Center. She has served as an independent expert on dozens of national and international committees. She was also the United Nations first Special Rapporteur on cultural rights. Her scholarship and practice have been dedicated to the rights of marginalized groups, including women, gender nonconforming individuals, those living with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, economically marginalized communities. She is highly decorated, having won international awards for her advocacy for the protection of minorities, including the Pakistan Prime Minister's Award for her co-authored book on women's rights, 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back. Ms. Shaheed's professional life, in other words, has been characterized by service to those least likely to be in power, those most likely to be forgotten, those caught in struggles that are not of their own making, but yet who possess the inherent dignity of all human persons and whose rights must be preserved. It is this scholar and this leader whose voice we're privileged to hear today. On behalf of the Johns Hopkins University, all of us welcome you and we honor you.
Thank you so much for having me here. It is a true honor to be the Special Rapporteur for Education. The mandate itself last year turned 25 years. So certainly there has been a collective understanding of this for some time now, for decades. I am new to the mandate, having just assumed my responsibility as the Special Rapporteur in late 2022. Of course, just on the heels of COVID and the pandemic that had so much influence for learners across the different ages, etc. So this is something I'm very happy to be here. I'm learning as I continue. We all need to continue to learn, and I'm learning as I go forward on what may be some of the critical issues facing education. And the right to education, of course, has evolved from the right to just be included, to equal education, to a right to have quality and inclusive education. And there's growing understanding of that. There's growing consensus on the need for early childhood education to start people off on the right foot. And so I think the mandate has really managed to put into place a number of key principles to take the education, the right to education forward. I will say the first mandate holder started by giving what is now commonly known as the 4 A's. So the 4 A's is if you have education for all, it needs to be available. That means you needed sufficient infrastructure and schools, institutions that are looking after it. It means it has to be accessible. So that is accessible in terms of distance, in terms of physical ability, etc. So there's a whole. It needs to be affordable. So because education, even when tuition is free, is not free. If you have to pay for transport, if you have to pay for the ancillary costs, sometimes uniforms, sometimes school books, or other aspects which need to be paid for. And the fourth is adaptability, because we're understanding that not all children have the same learning pathways, and that the emphasis should not be on executing and putting together an educational system that should apply to everyone. The educational system must respond to the needs of learners and adapt to their particular needs, which could be in terms of being visually or otherwise impaired. It could be also in terms of language and access. So there are multiple things that come into this. I am proposing, since I've come into the mandate, a 5th A, and that 5th A is accountability. So this is, in a nutshell, what the mandate is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. So yours obviously is a tough job, and but you do have a deep history of performance, hence the reason you're back to it again. Tell us about your background in sociology and feminist human rights. In Pakistan, where you lead the country's leading organization, Gender Justice and Human Rights. And tell us why you're back to the UN orbit, because this is not your first rodeo in the UN, right? You had held the role of a special rapporteur on cultural rights from 2009 to 2015, right? So I'm really curious, could you just kind of put those together for us?
Okay. So I like to say I'm a sociologist by training and an activist by choice. So these are the two things that I'm passionate about. I love my sociology. I love doing research. I love doing different kinds of research, including innovative, qualitative research. Increasingly, participatory research action approaches is what interests me, and I continue to do that. I returned home in time for the military takeover. 1977, academic freedom started being curtailed. I was in a center of research. Our work was stopped. We were not able to publish. They took away the people who were managing us. And at the same time, the military started using the excuse of religion to rescind rights of women, of minorities, and various other vulnerable peoples. Chiedo was very small, and we decided, we were 9 people. I joined Chiedo, it's a women's resource center. We were only 9 people, but we decided it was time to stand up and be counted when we heard of an atrocious judgment where a woman and a man had respectively been sentenced to 100 flogging, whipping, and stoning to death. And we said this was not acceptable. So we ended up starting what came to be known in its English title as the Women's Action Forum, which is one of the first voices opposing the military regime. So since then, I've been active in the field of resistance and promotion of women's rights and other excluded people. I'm actually a latecomer to the UN, if you ask me, because we were so busy struggling with our domestic issues and trying to ensure we were not very sure whether the UN would have any ability to impact our lives on the ground. But in the 1990s, after the military regime came to an end, the UN had very important conferences around human rights. So you had the 92 was the conference on environment for the first time. Concern was expressed. 93 was human rights in Vienna. 94 was population and development. 95 was the fourth women's conference, the fourth World Conference on Women, which was held in Beijing. And really, I became active in that, and Chiedo itself was active in all of these and follow-up, etc. So my friends actually pushed me into coming into the first mandate. At that point, you were nominated by people. You went through a selection procedure. So yes, I think there's a lot of skepticism about whether the UN can really make a difference. But the UN has three pillars, and I think the development, the human rights, and peace. And I think people are most skeptical about peace than human rights. They're not so skeptical about the development part of it. But I just feel that even if you didn't have the UN, you might have to invent the UN. We do need a forum where the world's diverse people with all of their differences have a place to come together and to discuss and try and see what we want as a people, as a humanity altogether. Where do we want to see our world going? So we need to come up with standards. We need to come up with principles. And I think at the moment, imperfect as it is, it's the only forum that allows us to do that. And in terms of my own mandate as a special procedure mandate holder, I don't know yet because mandate on education is fairly new, but I do know as the special rapporteur on cultural rights, I do know I had tangible results. I also know that we were able to use what is being called the boomerang effect. If people are not listening at home, you can bring in the principles, the conventions, the international treaties of the UN and say, if you're a signatory to it, you can use that to influence your own government and actions on the ground. So I do think, it's a back and forth. Nothing is perfect, but then we all have to commit to making it more worthwhile. And while I think that is largely the responsibility and ability of states who are member states of the United Nations, I do think there's a very important role for civil society, academia, and other experts to voice what they think are the concerns and to articulate what may be some of the solutions or the standards that we need to have for everyone to follow.
Thank you.
So, Farida, you in Dr. Berner's introductory comments talked about expectations with regard to education being delivered in a culturally appropriate way.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about cultural rights and educational rights, the overlap between the two, where there are conflicts or potential conflicts?
Well, let me just start by saying I don't think there's a potential conflict.
Okay.
I think all human rights are, they're inalienable, they're indivisible, they're interdependent. And one does not take away from the other. So I think that's just to put it out there. It was my honor, privilege, and challenge to try and set out the initial, what are cultural rights? Because I was the first to hold that mandate. And I have to say, at the basic, cultural rights is about being able to access, to participate in, and to contribute to cultural life in all its facets. It is not about preserving culture. And I think this is a big mistake that people make. All cultures, regardless of where we are, which historical moment we talk about, what economic, social, cultural situation we're in, all cultures have practices which do not align with human rights. So all cultures, otherwise we wouldn't need the human rights movement and etc. But you need to have that understanding evolving within the community in order to come forward. culture, I keep saying, it's not an object. I can't hand you culture, right? It's not something. We invent it. There's no culture outside human beings. So we are constantly in the process of renewing that cultural understanding, the values. So for me, cultural rights is really essentially ensuring that everyone has the right to participate and access and contribute. And the right to participate includes not participating in any ritual or process or procedure that undermines my human dignity, regardless of how old it may be. It also means that everyone has the right to decide what parts of cultural heritage, meaning just things that are transmitted from one generation to the next and what we hold to be valuable. What things should be continued, what things need to be changed, and what things absolutely need to be completely stopped once and for all. And so I think there's an important difference to understand between cultural diversity, which must be supported, and legitimate rights for cultural diversity to be recognized in education as well as in our everyday other aspects of our lives, but also to not have culture used as an excuse to not uphold human rights. And so as a women's rights activist, I'm very, very keen on this. Now, absolutely, I do not think that anyone has a right to say, I don't have rights because of a cultural thing. I think culture is too often used to justify existing hierarchies of power and authority at the benefit of some to the exclusion of others. And I think that's what needs to change. But you need that discussion to take place internally. At the end of the day, human rights don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in very specific socio-cultural, economic, political environments. And culture is about being able, I should be able to be as part of as many cultural communities of shared values as I want to. I should be able to leave them and rejoin them and create new ones at the same time without any fear of punitive action. And that doesn't happen. So I think, on the other hand, you have the education. I think is very closely related in many ways to cultural rights, because cultural rights is about having the means to develop your collective identity, your individual identity, being able to assign meanings to what is the world all about, what does development mean for me, and I think education provides that same pathway, or should provide that pathway for us to be able to understand, to develop that cultural competency. And all our societies are now multicultural. And I think that's one of the aspects that needs to be seen in terms of education. I've already said the classroom diversity needs to be reflected in the educators and their understanding. So that's one part of it, but there are also very specific overlaps. So for instance, I wrote 2 consecutive reports as the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights on history and textbooks and on memorializations, museums, and monuments. And those are very much part of education as well. You are taught history. But my argument there was that you need multi-voice narratives of history. You can have the same facts, but very different experiences of that same event. So I think that's one of the overlaps. I also wrote 3 different reports which relate to enjoying the benefits of scientific freedoms and scientific progress. And I think that's, again, something that relates to higher education, to research and where we go with that. That has important aspects of being recognized as the author of something, of creator of something, whether it's scientific or it's artistic. So that's really human creativity. And that is what cultural rights is protecting in many ways. Education should be promoting exactly the same thing. So I think there's a number of places where we overlap and where it reinforces each other. I really don't think cultural rights clash with other rights. And I think all rights should be able to be interdependent and help each other. I do think cultural rights, like education, the right to education, are both empowering and transformative rights, because they both open pathways to so many other rights, which you can't have if you don't enjoy your cultural rights, or if you don't enjoy your right to education. So I think they're very closely interrelated.
Thank you.
I want to quote something you said recently.
Unfortunately, human rights as they are applied today, as they're implemented today, are not universal or indivisible. End of quote. What did you mean by this specifically? Are there case studies and lessons learned that we here in the United States should be mindful of?
I wouldn't talk about any specifics that you need to be mindful of. I said that statement was made last year at the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course states do not have to endorse to follow, because all member states of the United Nations are bound by the Universal Declaration. So it was the 75th anniversary. It was the 30th anniversary of the Human Rights Conference that was held in Vienna. It was the 25th anniversary of the Mandate to Education. It was also the midway point for the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So while I said this, I will also tell you that the Secretary General of the United Nations said the SDGs are in deep trouble. That was also last year. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said these are challenging times for human rights. And so I think that is what I was referring to. Since 2019, we've seen a lot of development, many social economic crises in many different parts of the world. You have extreme poverty, which has become more widespread, and it's become more extreme. We've had COVID-19, the pandemic that just completely reshuffled so many aspects. It increased and exacerbated inequalities across the world. It led to the loss of lives, but also livelihoods, and deprived many people of their futures, of what they had thought their futures would look like. And in terms of education, it affected 1.5 billion students across the world. And I think the net result of all of these crises happening together has led to a poorer implementation of human rights across the board. And I think that includes education. And I think that's what it is. And to me, our failure to ensure, so in reality, it's not universal. In reality, everyone is not enjoying, on the basis of equality, all the human rights to which we are entitled. And I think the failure to do so is a moral failing on our parts. It's a political failing. And I think we're not really understanding the whole impact on humanity of human suffering that is the result of not being able to uphold that. We have so many pronounced divides between countries and within countries. And I think there's also, people keep talking about cultural relativism, as a way to impede human rights for all. But you have other people who talk about there are too many double standards, there are false standards. There's a false hierarchy being imposed on one right over another right, whereas all human rights should be equal. And I think this is an affront every day to the idea of human rights. And so at the end of the day, I think the real question we need to ask ourselves is whether as communities, as societies, as countries, we are wanting, if we are committed to the idea that all human rights have equal human right, all human beings have equal human rights by virtue of being human. You don't have to do anything else, but if we believe in that, that is the entitlement of everyone, regardless of location, of background, of education, etc., then we have to commit to making that happen, because I think it's something that's important for the future of the world. I think what I said as a special rapporteur on cultural rights, I still believe in, that you see what is encouraging is so many more people accepting the principles of human rights and using them as a standard to change what's happening on the ground. And I think that's what needs to happen, because just words by themselves are really not meaningful. We need that to translate into concrete actions so that everybody can enjoy the full compendium of human rights on the basis of equality.
Thank you.
So a recent UNESCO report on the role of non-state actors in education noted that in many systems around the world, 80%, according to UNESCO, share the delivery of education between state, private, and civil society institutions. This didn't come as a surprise to me as an educational researcher. It probably didn't come as a surprise to you, but it very much comes as a surprise to many Americans, right? We do not have this pluralistic approach to our educational system. When you think about this, how do you think a pluralistic approach like this can be leveraged to benefit students, particularly students who might not have access to education, low-income students, or not access to high-quality education? And what are the risks of a pluralistic approach that need to be mediated from a policy perspective?
I think what we have to ensure is whatever is available is equitable. I don't say equal, it's equitable, because people who are located differently have different needs, and you cannot support, if you support them equally, they will never become equal. So those, for instance, who come from remote areas, who live in remote areas, rural areas, those who don't have connectivity, for instance, to the internet, we need to ensure they have the same opportunities. And so, I mean, I think the diversity has always been there, and I think if you look at the report you're referring to is actually about private sector, and the private sector has always existed in education. Has had multiple faces. There are many different actors, and some of the actors are community actors. They're for-profit and they're not-for-profit. So there's a whole range. I think the real question that many mandate holders before me have pointed out, I think the question is the rapid, unregulated growth of the private sector on the one hand, and on the other, an apparent withdrawing of states from their primary responsibility to ensure education for all. And I think that's where the tension lies. It's not so much a question of choice as a question of ensuring that the public education system does provide equal opportunities for everyone, does ensure that all students and all learners are catered to. And I think many of the private sector institutions don't necessarily do that. They don't cater to the most excluded, which from a human rights perspective is where you need to start from. If you're going to also, the Sustainable Development Goals also say, leave no one behind. If we're going to ensure that no one is left behind, then we have to privilege the funding and resources available. I think states, the recommendation has been, what is it? I have it written because I don't remember it all the time. The 2011 Yomtam statement says 6% of the GDP. So all states should dedicate at least 6% of the GDP or 20% of their national budgets for education. Then you can start to see the difference. So you have the right of parents on the one hand to choose an education which is in keeping with their moral understanding of what their children should need. You also have the obligation of the states to provide public education that is of quality and that does meet everyone's needs. Otherwise, parents wouldn't have an option. You can only have an option if the state also provides that, so you can go on. And I think there's other aspects that need to be looked at. You have to see the Child Rights Convention, for instance, is very specific in terms of what is needed and that they're rights of the children as well. So while parents have rights, children, those rights cannot be at the expense of children's rights. So they must have access to the full area of ideas and materials and thinking so that they can develop their critical thinking, so they can reach their full potential. And also, I think parents' rights, we have to be careful, should not be undermining the autonomy of teachers. That's another area which sometimes is a question mark. How do you deal with that? But the plurality, I don't think is an issue. I think all the systems need to come together to ensure that everyone's needs are catered to. And basically, at the end of the day, apart from the 4 A's and my 5th A, in terms of what is the right to education, education is the right to lifelong learning. And that is, has been explained as the right to know, the right to do, the right to live together, and the right to be. And I think we need to ensure that that is happening through our educational systems. I fear or I'm concerned at increasingly a push to narrow the definition of education, that education is being narrowed to skill acquisition for the market, which I think is only one part of what education needs to do. So if we think of learning to be, learning to live together, and the human rights instruments very specifically say that it must ensure that people have the possibility of reaching their full potential, that it must support an understanding of differences amongst people, amongst nations, and at the end of the day, it should also promote peace. So some of these things are already laid out in the international human rights language, the purpose of education. So I think that's what I would like to see. It's not that the diversity should not be there, it's that everything should work together. And I suspect some civil society organizations also are concerned at the undue influence that some private sectors seem to be getting in terms of policymaking spaces. Because they have funds, because they are able to finance, they feel that the others are then not being given the same voice. I also think that in terms of early education, which is a relatively new concept which has increasing consensus on, we have to be careful that it's not all formalized, right? So your families, communities, neighborhoods also have a role in education, which is not the formalized education, but it's the non-formal. But that often is very important. And for early childhood, for instance, it cannot just be institutionalized. You have, sometimes it'll be grandparents or relatives or your neighbors. So we need to do things that education is not limited to the school. The school is very important, but it also needs to be in communities, neighborhood spaces where that continues to be and where people come together.
Thank you.
And so you just talked about, the different responsibilities of the different actors, right? And different stakeholders within that ecosystem. The fact that people have to live up to their responsibilities, but their rights also have to be respected. But I think one of the vexing issues that we're grappling with is the fact that even within this collaborative venture, it is still fraught, right? It's increasingly fraught with tension. How do you suppose, or do you have any ideas for how to resolve this tension between parents' rights and the rights of state, right, in moving forward the goal, the right to educate? And just another one, your next thematic report to be focused on the right to academic freedom. How important is that freedom? And can you explain what the links between the right to education and academic freedom, what that link looks like right now?
Well, I mean, to come to your question, which is related to the previous question quite a lot, I just want to say that it's to emphasize the UNESCO's report that was being referred to, puts it in a nutshell, which is, I really like that expression, who chooses and who loses. So when you're looking at the plurality of what exists, I think that needs to be looked at. So who is doing the choosing and who may be losing out in the systems that we have here? I think there's multiple aspects, as I said, to the right to education. The right to parent, as I said, parents have rights to choose, but that cannot be undermining the right of children to education. So if your parent decides that as a girl you shouldn't be attending school, I think that's contravening the girl's right to education. So I think we need to have that balancing always between, yes, there's a choice here, but at the same time, it cannot deprive people of the right to education on a basis of equality, whether it's in terms of gender or other identities that may be there. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And the respect and liberty of parents, I think, has to be balanced with the rights of the child. And the Child's Right Convention, for instance, very specifically talks about the best interests of the child must be kept in the forefront. And I think that's where the tension, I agree there's tension, but I think these are things that we're still working out. I wish I had very specific recommendations. I don't. I think these are places where we have to negotiate, where we have to dialogue, where you have to sit together and find the best route for that particular situation. I don't think every situation is the same. And in terms of academic freedom, well, I think academic freedom is critical to education. If we are learning, if the whole possibility, education is learning to learn in many ways, right? So if we don't have academic freedom, if we shut down certain aspects of thinking, critical thinking, new thinking, challenging notions that exist, I don't think it's very helpful for us to develop further. I think sometimes it is precisely the clash of ideas. And if you talk to scientists, they're quite clear that they put forward theories in order that somebody else may challenge them and come up with something different. And I think I have been shocked by the number of communications I've received from around the world where academic freedoms are coming under pressure. So as I said, when I went back to Pakistan, I discovered the same thing myself. But it's the number of people from across the world who are being penalized for things that they may be saying in classrooms, but saying outside classrooms also. And I think academic freedom also encompasses the right of students and academics and faculty to critique the norms within their institutions. So they should not be stopped from not doing that. But certainly exploring ideas, I think classrooms and academia must be places where you're able to explore all things, whether they are approved or not approved. I mean, if we had Galileo and no academic freedom, you would not have gotten a lot of things, right? So you have to think about thinking outside the box, and that should not be penalized. And I'm shocked by the number of book bans that are taking place, of subjects that are being excluded, and surveillance of teachers as well as students across the world. And some of these are very obvious censorship. Some of them are more subtle in terms of stopping promotions, not having tenureship. I think tenureship is a very important aspect of academic freedom, which should be preserved. So I hope that gives you some ideas.
It does. Thank you.
I think we have some audience questions that we're going to respond to.
We do indeed. We have quite a few questions coming in from our live stream audience. Thank you all very much. I'm just going to pull out two of them and hope we have time to explore. The first is this. You mentioned, Special Reporter, that cultures are not static, that they evolve and are changing. They can also oppress. It's a tension-fraught area. So the question is, what does one say to communities as an advocate, as a way of advancing the dialogue?
Well, what I have said in the past is that what you need is an indigenization of human rights. The very concept of human rights has to make sense to people. And that sometimes needs a cultural interpretation. The change cannot be from outside. I'm quite clear. You can't come from one culture and say, okay, your culture is doing this wrong, so you need to change. That's never going to be embedded. It's never going to be owned in the same way. You need that challenge to occur and the change to occur within communities. But I think that does happen. So I think you need to find the lexicons that make sense within a particular cultural context and expand to the widest possible the framework. But I think you also need to be supported. I keep saying, people talk about families and communities. So if I look at my hand, it's one, right? But each one is different. And each one of my fingers and within a community doesn't have the same power. So we need to acknowledge the differences in power. And why should a minority view not be seemed as authentic as a majority view? And I think that's but it needs to be an internal discussion to take it forward.
Any follow-ups to that from our Dean or Vice Dean?
So you mentioned in one of your earlier answers, I think in your opening remarks,
The fifth A, you're introducing the fifth A, right? There will be sixth A soon, I'm sure, as well. Where does, in both the most recent answer as well as the answer around pluralistic approaches to education, where is there a dividing line in your mind between accountability and inappropriate actions by governments that do constrain human rights? How do you hold pluralistic approaches to education accountable while still retaining individuals and organizational rights?
Well, I think all institutions need to be accountable. So it's not a question of whether they're public or private. I think public and private need to be accountable. So I come from a country where there's a very high percentage of public-private partnership going on, especially in the field of health and of education. However, I still believe very firmly that the provision of health and the provision of education is primarily the state's responsibility. The experience is not over when you have these public-private partnerships. They are not necessarily as open and transparent about the information, that the way in which they are conducting their business. So if we expect the government to be accountable, I also want the private sector to be accountable, especially when they're in partnership with the government. When you have private institutions which are entirely private, because the definition of a public institution is actually quite varied. Do they get public funding, or is it a public institution which gets private funding, et cetera, et cetera? So I won't get into that. But I do think the accountability has to be there. And if we can make those things transparent, I believe we have better governance and we have better democratic inclusion in terms of decision-making and going forward. Thank you.
So as a last question before we have closing remarks, and I'd like to pose this one that came through. There are many depressing things in the world right now. It's easy to get discouraged. Would you be able to give us some concrete positive outcomes that have come as a result of the UN's mandates in cultural rights, since you're new to education rights? You mentioned changing on the ground. Could we have some examples?
Oh, thank you. Well, I was first at a lecture at Columbia University a year into my mandate, year and a half, 2 years, and the students asked me what I had done. I had to say, don't know yet. But at the end of the 6 years of the mandate, I did see, for instance, Norway and a couple of other Scandinavian countries reshape their entire cultural policy on the basis of the reports that I had written. Latin American countries, in particular cities, Montevideo and Buenos Aires and others, have used my report. The French have used my report to bring up the policies that are needed. On the other hand, you have my artistic freedoms report has been used incessantly by artist groups, and they did not think that the UN was a space for them. And so when I had rappers come and I said, speak and rap, don't speak, don't feel obliged to speak UNese. They didn't, because they were awkward. Now I go and I see that space has been taken over. They have a space to articulate their needs as artists, which I think is very pleasing. I know my report on advertising has been picked up by specific schools in places as diverse as Brazil and Ireland to eliminate or minimize the amount of advertising that children have in school, because they felt that is a sacred space. They should not be bombarded. As it is, we're bombarded by so many messages all the time now. It's difficult to distinguish. But I think so they are very concrete. But I will end with something else, which is many years ago, I was running in Chiedo a program that's called Women, Law and Status. And my 12-year-old son, then one fine day, said, okay, you've been running this for how long? And I said, for X number of years. And he said, how many laws have you changed? So, not any. So I had to think, and then I said, but what's really important is changing people's lives, which we do, even if we don't change the laws. So I think sometimes you use things to change how the lives of people, which is perhaps as important as changing the laws and policies.
Well, I suspect that's a good place for us to end, thinking about the positive change that you've created already. And we look for, in a few years, the same report on educational rights. So I want to thank the Special Rapporteur for joining us for this hour, my co-moderator Chichi for joining us, and for the audience joining us here at the Bloomberg Center in DC at Johns Hopkins University. Good afternoon.